Thank you so much for being here. Good evening. My name is Peter Steeves, and it's my privilege to be the director of the DePaul Humanities Center. And I'm really pleased to welcome you to the penultimate installment in our Year of Filth programming, as tonight we investigate bourgeois disgust, cleanliness, and its discontents. We first begin, though, as we always begin at the Humanities Center, by acknowledging the traditional territory upon which we gather this evening. Long before Europeans arrived, varied and numerous native people sought to walk gently on this land. They offered assistance to the first European travelers to this territory, sharing their knowledge for survival and living a good life. Among others, the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, Miami, and Illinois inhabited what is now this part of Chicago. And while we here today have no power to honor the treaties that were signed, we do recognize that these treaties were brokered under some duress and deception. So it's our hope tonight to honor the good faith with which the native people of the region entered into these treaties. As Potawatomi Chief Matea is purported to have said at the signing of the 1821 Treaty of Chicago, quote, "This is a small piece of land, and if we give it away, what will become of us? The Great Spirit who has provided it for our use allows us to keep it. We should incur his anger if we bartered it away. If we had more land, you should get more. But our land has been wasting away ever since the white people became our neighbors. We now have hardly enough left to cover the bones of our tribe," end quote. In solidarity with Chief Matea, we recognize the history of this legacy and of this subjugation, as well as the enduring presence today of Native Americans among our faculty, staff, student body, and community. And it's thus that we seek a new relationship with the original people of this land, one based on true respect, as we also reaffirm our general and driving dedication to finding ways, both institutionally and personally, for the work that we do at the Humanities Center to be a model of what it means to be dedicated to making our society a more enlightened and just place for everyone in our community. So thank you again for being here tonight. Did you know that apart from eating wood, beavers repeatedly eat their own poop? Over and over, they eat that poop, and then repeat. Eventually, the last waste cycle is almost 100% sawdust that comes out. This repeated poop eating is one of the most efficient ingestion, digestion, excretion systems that nature has ever invented. It's amazing, effective, and economical. And of course, it's also completely disgusting. Now, it's not difficult to make the case that the beaver's eating practices are both environmentally and morally praiseworthy. There's something wonderful about this model of efficiency with an even weird sense of purity at work, like the beavers have got it figured out. And yet, I imagine that for most of us, we're disgusted by imagining the beaver eating his own poop, let alone imagining us eating ours. Why is it so easy in our culture to find the smell of a homeless person disgusting, but not to be disgusted by poverty and homelessness itself? How is it that we can so easily be disgusted by a diseased body part, but not by the suffering of those who are diseased? Perhaps you might think it's because disgust is something best understood as a sensory reaction of the physical body, not something intellectual or ethical. But there is a long history of talk of moral disgust. The study of disgust has been seeing a renaissance over the last 20 years or so, first coming to the attention of late Enlightenment thinkers, and now in the 21st century, suddenly once again a topic of great interest. In general, the modern take on disgust seems to come at the question from two angles: the science of disgust and also the philosophy of it. And there are, of course, overlaps. Art Markman, a cognitive scientist at the University of Texas, for instance, argues that research bears out that disgust is triggered by perceived impurities. In one test, subjects read about stories containing various social taboos. For example, a brother and a sister who try to find time in private so that they can make out and kiss passionately. Analyzing subjects' responses to these sorts of stories compared to stories about shoplifting or other violations of norms, the researchers found, in Markman's words, that violations of a sense of moral purity are the ones that lead us to feel the emotion of disgust. Now, our final event in the Year of Filth, which takes place at the end of this month, will focus specifically on the topic of purity. But it's worth noting this evening that there could very well be some correlation between what we might want to term corruption and disgust. Perhaps we might find a relation between, on the one hand, the idea of siblings being sexually attracted to each other, and on the other hand, the act of eating one's own feces, in terms of the perceived corruption of the purity of the concepts. Brothers and sisters, we think, are related in one way, a way that we're told precludes other sorts of relations. Excrement is food that has already been eaten and processed. To see it as food again calls into question what we even mean by the term food. Perhaps then the fragility of certain concepts is what gives rise to disgust. We think we know what siblings or food means, but our well-ordered world comes into question, and the fear of living without the ability to impose structure by means of concepts gives us a feeling in the pit of our stomach, a sort of nauseous vertigo of no longer being in charge, no longer categorizing and thus controlling the world. In some ways, many Enlightenment thinkers argued something quite the opposite, that disgust is the result of the excess of something that is otherwise good, an excess that is too intense, too pure, too untouched by something external to it. According to Immanuel Kant here, for instance, the very thing which is beautiful evokes disgust. This is related to his argument that we only experience aesthetic pleasure if there's something that is held back in an object, something that remains to be discovered or intensified. We can keep the beautiful from turning into the disgusting, either by refusing to move toward excess or by adding something contrary along the way. So for instance, the most delicious cheesecake in the world might be wonderful to taste, but you would likely find it disgusting to imagine having to eat 20 full pieces in one sitting. Or we might say that the smell of a rose is beautiful, but if that smell were to become all that you could smell, if you were doused in rose-scented perfume 24/7 for the next few days, you might find that smell stomach-turning. Now, for an example of how to stop the de-evolution of something good into something disgusting by means of adding the contrary, we'll let Kant speak for himself. He writes, "A woman is not embarrassed that she does not possess certain high insights, that she is timid and not fit for serious employment. She is beautiful and captivates, and that is enough." He continues, "In France, the woman sets the tone in all companies and all society. Now, it can scarcely be denied that without the beautiful sex, social gatherings are rather savorless and boring. But if women supply them with a tone of beauty, it is up to men to supply a tone of nobility. Otherwise, social intercourse becomes equally boring, but for opposite reasons, because nothing evokes as much disgust as sheer sweetness." So I've chosen these passages from Kant, horrifically misogynistic as they are, not only to help explicate his idea that too much purity of an aesthetically good thing can make it bad, but also so that it becomes clear to us exactly how relative to time and culture our conceptions of purity, excess, and disgust might be. The takeaway from Kant, then, is not merely that sweetness alone can be disgusting, but that he associates this potential excess with women having too much power and presence. Defenders of Kant, of course, would say that we need to extract the philosophy, the arguments about universal and necessary aesthetic experience, from the unfortunate cultural attitudes of his time that led to these sexist examples. But my late colleague Emmanuel Ezi used to argue that if we removed the racism from Kant, it would affect his entire philosophical program, because the racism was silently at work even in Kant's epistemology. I wonder here if the same might not be true for removing the misogyny. Now, art, perhaps, is the most fruitful arena in which to explore questions of taste, beauty, culture, and even the nature of concepts. As we've said many times on this stage, Cézanne was surely interrogating apples in his work, pushing them to the limits of what it means to be an apple. What then of art that is meant to test the limits of corruption, purity, and disgust? The gleaners that we just saw in Agnes Varda's wonderful film are close cousins to dumpster divers, looking for food in the trash others have discarded, re-eating, in a sense, the excrement of society. Ruby Silvius's 2007 mixed media work, The Gleaners Do Community Service, is made from trash items: watercolor on a used napkin, a tea bag rescued from the garbage. But the work itself probably does not elicit any feelings of disgust. Paper products themselves aren't obvious candidates for evoking revulsion. Now compare this to Mark Quinn's Self, a series of sculptures of the artist's own head made every 5 years since 1991. You're looking at one here from 2011. Quinn began the series while an alcoholic, and he searched for some way to feature addiction and dependency in the method of his self-presentation. He considered the idea of each iteration of his bust needing something to be maintained as a whole, finally landing on the notion of refrigeration. So, Every 5 years, over the course of a couple of months, Quinn removes some of his own blood. When he finally has about 1¼ gallons, he casts a mold of his head and freezes the blood solid in the mold. Once the silicone form is removed and the bust is put on display, if the art were to be unplugged or its freezing display pedestal should falter, the self would not survive. It is as dependent on electricity as Quinn himself is on alcohol. So we haven't yet mentioned Freud, and perhaps he would say that such blood art is uncanny, and this is why we're a bit unsettled by it. The uncanny is most basically something that appears both as familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. So we know we have blood inside of us and that it fulfills a biological function needed for life. But when we see blood outside and see it doing aesthetic work that doesn't seem immediately necessary, we have a hard time coming to grips with it. Especially in the shape of a head, it's familiar and unfamiliar, and thus the source of a kind of anxiety. An anxiety some experience as a repulsion. Or consider Dieter Roth's 1968 Bunny Dropping Bunny, in which the artist used a Lindt chocolate rabbit mold to make his own chocolate Easter bunny, but not out of chocolate, but instead rabbit poop and straw from domestic rabbit bedding. Perhaps it's once again the association between food and feces that disgusts us here, or the corruption of categories. Perhaps it's an example of the extreme, not of sweetness and chocolate, but of something like its opposite. Roth's bunny is arguably aesthetically pleasing in its shape. Before you found out that the rabbit was made of poop, it's unlikely you would have thought of this as disgusting. It's interesting to note, in fact, that when questioned, a large percentage of people found Quinn's blood self-portrait and Roth's poop bunny to be equally disgusting. According to Freud, a reaction formation is something that creates a conscious experience that's the opposite of what the unconscious experiences. As early as 1908, Freud argued that there's a hidden pleasure in the act of defecating and in the handling of feces. This is usually tied to anal eroticism in general. But because this is not acceptable to acknowledge, the reaction formation creates the opposite experience of disgust when we encounter feces. On some level, then, we actually like and are drawn to excrement. Civilization, however, and especially the bourgeois class, will not allow this to be acknowledged. And so disgust is what we outwardly and consciously feel, the lie we secretly tell ourselves and the world, all while not really being disgusted at all. The public and conscious reminder through the medium of art that feces might be aesthetically beautiful, that it might actually be related to pleasure, creates a complicated and conflicting experience. And here, with the pointing of the blame at bourgeois civilization, we have an approach to thinking about the way in which our cultural indoctrination might be the foundation for what we experience as disgusting and clean. Those of you who were with us some 17 months ago for our celebration of the centennial of the Russian Revolution will remember that we spoke at length about the problems that Lenin and the founders of the Soviet state faced when striving to create a revolutionary and proletariat spirit in the culture from the top down. The bourgeois institutions that had created the art of Russia previously had, of course, also created Russian senses of beauty and disgust. Though the peasants did not have access to those means of production, those ideologies had filtered their way down from the aristocracy, such that, for instance, classical music and exquisite oil paintings, typically of rich people and the trappings of their opulent living, were considered high art, the pinnacle of beauty, even by the poor. Lenin wanted to create institutions that would make this kind of art appear now as disgusting, and instead, the culture would come to celebrate a lowly, everyday, working-class aesthetic. At first, they tried orchestras, but without any conductors. Soon, there was music played with anvils, celebrating the factory workers, or paintings that took up social realist trajectories, depicting the scenes of proletariat power, as well as suprematist art, focusing on the purity of a feeling that might arise from non-representational art, consisting of mostly color and a geometric shape. It is ill-fated to control culture from the top down, but one sees the dilemma of the revolutionary. In order to have a healthy and non-bourgeois conception of beauty and disgust, one must have the cultural structures that help give rise to these values. But in order for the people to support the establishment of these institutions and structures, they must already have a non-bourgeois sensibility. Without a central planning committee, this struggle continues around the world in nearly every culture, including our own. So there's much more I'm tempted to talk about tonight. We haven't yet discussed the debatable claim that disgust is tied more to smell and taste than any of the other senses. We haven't dissected the questionable yet popular notion that evolution instilled disgust in us because it promotes health and cleanliness. And we haven't done a real phenomenology of disgust in which we look at all the ways in which disgust can be experienced and find what they have in common. But in the interest of time, I will instead conclude with two personal brief stories that might at least put us on the road toward such a phenomenology, especially as we think about the relationships among disgust, culture, history, and class. So, which of these photos looks more disgusting to you? I probably agree with you, but I wish that I didn't, and here's why. I was born in the rural Midwest, and to be frank, grew up quite poor. The 1970s and 80s were a time that most of the family farms that surrounded the small house my family rented and shared with another family were starting to fail. The Rust Belt was starting to rust too as factories came on hard times. Apart from my teachers in public school, few people I knew had ever gone to college. I didn't know a single vegetarian. I never really chose to eat meat. It never appeared as a choice or not. Of course, this is the way it often is with culture and with class. The fish never notices water. When my father took off and abandoned me, my brother, and my mother, things got far worse in many respects. And by the time I turned 8, it was clear he wasn't coming back. And my grandfather chose to mark the occasion of my birthday by buying me a filet mignon, the very first steak I ever ate. He made a big deal about it, both in terms of the cost of it and the symbolism. Before I took my first hesitant bite, having never eaten a steak before, he leaned in and whispered in my ear, "You're the man of the house now. It all rests on your shoulders." So one need not be a committed Freudian to imagine how meaningful that moment was, and how misogyny, carnality, class, and a few other messy things got mixed together in my psyche that day. When I went off to do my undergraduate degree a few years later, I took a course in which I read about the Jains and the Hindus and other groups of people who were vegetarians. I realized it was, in fact, a possible choice. I'd been living a completely unexamined life in that aspect of my life. And so I decided to investigate the ethics of killing non-human animals. And I came to the conclusion a few days later that there seemed to be no sound arguments in favor of it. I committed myself to being a vegetarian, and I have been so for more than 3 decades now, never eating meat. But here's the thing. I have friends who are moral vegetarians, and they often say that meat looks disgusting to them. They see it for what it is, not a steak dripping with delicious juices, but a slab of muscle from a murdered fellow being sitting in a pool of warmed blood. It's grotesque, stomach-turning, not fit for putting in one's mouth. The ethical disgust has transferred to a physical disgust for them. Meat is murder. I agree. But for me, after all of these many years, I salivate when I smell meat cooking. I see a piece of meat like this, and it appears as good and delicious. I wish so deeply that my reaction were one of physical disgust, but it isn't. The ethical disgust has always won out. I've never tasted meat again. But I often feel like something's wrong with me, like I should be nauseated by the sight of this cadaver on a plate. I should feel how bad it is. It should sicken me. Overcoming the past is apparently a little difficult. So that's a pretty intense story. So I'll just add this final one, which is a bit less demanding, though potentially just as embarrassing, I suppose. So for Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Easter meals when I was growing up, my favorite side dish was something called pear and cream cheese salad. I think that my grandmother found the recipe in Women's Day magazine or the parade supplement of the Sunday newspaper at some point in the 1950s. It has that feel of a 50s Midwestern recipe, and the family tradition existed long before I was born. And I say recipe in quotes somewhat unfairly because, like many Midwestern recipes of the time, it merely involves opening cans and packages, mixing together pre-prepared items. But already to characterize this as an illegitimate recipe is to make a class distinction, to put down Midwestern rural culture as inherently unsophisticated, perhaps even, in terms of class, disgusting. Anyway, here's how you make pear and cream cheese salad. You cut the contents of 2 packages of cream cheese into cubes. Open 2 cans of pear halves in heavy syrup, and dice those pears as well. Mix the cream cheese and the pears in a serving bowl. Saving the pear juice from one of the cans, stir in several tablespoons of fake mayonnaise until it makes a thick, creamy sauce. Mix that into the pears and cream cheese. Then add in about half a bag of miniature marshmallows. That's it, delicious pear and cream cheese salad. I have fond memories of this, and I've made it and tried to serve it several times to people I've known as an adult. I'd say about 95% of them refuse even to try it, often saying the word disgust to describe their reaction. And we might say this is related to culture and history and past experiences in them as well. We might say that what is disgusting and what is desirable typically have something to do with one's childhood and the initial establishment of these categories. All of that's likely true. But I think we also have to admit that class does play a role in these sorts of judgments. We imagine that a certain sort of person not only eats food like this, but enjoys food like this. And if you note that you find such food to be disgusting, but someone else likes it, you likely also think you know a lot about that other person in general beyond just his love of this food, imagining a class distinction that separates you, and thus adopting all of the class-based assumptions that go along with that. The bourgeoisie, after all, do not serve pear and cream cheese salad, Funyuns, and Mountain Dew at their dinner parties. And I'm reminded here of the philosopher Daniel Dennett, who's not a friend to animals, by the way, who once wrote about his concerns that a vulture seems to like eating decayed meat. How do we know, Dennett wondered, that the bird doesn't find that food as disgusting as we do, choking it down because it's the only thing left available to its species? Eventually, Dennett comes to conceptualize non-humans as so different and alien that he wonders if the vulture has any experience of taste at all. Now, there are 1,000 things that are wrong with Dennett's position, I think, but it might be instructive to substitute class for species here and ask ourselves just how mystified, even in bad faith, we are by those of different classes, and if our physical and moral disgusts are not coupled together in complicated and perhaps oppressive ways by our imagination or our lack of imagination. People who work with their hands, often doing labor that involves getting dirty, often sweating and messing their clothes while they work. People who shop at Walmart, who can't afford the luxury of organic food. People who live in rural areas beyond the cocoon of urban life and technology that makes the filthy processes of living invisible. What do we assume about these people politically, ethically, culturally? How do our concepts of purity, goodness, and disgust do the secret and dirty political work of oppression on our behalf? So we convene tonight to discuss these matters and many others in related filthy constellations. But we turn now to our special guests, who will have far more nuanced and important things to say than I. I'm very grateful that they've given their time to be with us tonight, and thankful too for all of you being here. Allow me to propose then that, like gleaners, we now gather every intellectual morsel left on the ground, but like vultures and beavers, we go about this work not only efficiently, but with great enthusiasm and joy. Our first guest this evening is Pascale-Anne Brault, who is professor of French in the Modern Languages Department here at DePaul. She's a past fellow and past member of the executive committee at the DePaul Humanities Center, and we're very proud to have this long relationship with her. Pascale-Anne is the translator of Barbara Cassine's Nostalgia, When Are We Ever Home?, as well as the co-translator of works by Jean-François Lyotard and Jean-Luc Nancy. It is perhaps for her work translating and editing the rights of Jacques Derrida for which Pascale-Anne is most well known, and rightly so, as her efforts, along usually with her partner Michael Nass, have made so many important works by Derrida accessible to English-speaking audiences, helping to change the landscape of continental philosophy in this country in the process, and allowing those of us who are not exactly fluent in French, as you can no doubt tell from my horrible accent, to be able to read such important texts of Derrida's as The Other Heading, Memoirs of the Blind, Resistances of Psychoanalysis, Adieu, Rogues, Learning to Live Finely, Athens Still Remains, the list goes on. For this important work, Pascale-Anne has been recognized by her home country, receiving both the Chevalier dans l'Ordre du Palme Académique from the French Ministry of Education and the prestigious Chevalier dans l'Ordre du Mérite from the French government. And though we were all saddened to hear the passing of Agnes Varda last week, I can think of no better person to speak to Varda's importance and legacy than our first presenter this evening. So with her lecture entitled Agnes Varda in the Field of Cinema, The Self-Portrait of a Gleaner, please join me in welcoming Pascale-Anne Brault.
Thank you all for being here tonight and for giving me the chance to share a few words about one of my favorite directors, Agnes Varda. Let me begin with a question of translation, because as Peter so generously indicated, my life is indeed steeped in translation, a life spent trying to mend linguistic and cultural differences, as it were. As many of you know, a lot can get lost in translation, though a lot can be gained, as we will see. And my first objective today will be to try to show how the translation of the title into English slightly reorients our understanding of the film. So, the title, Les Glaneurs et la Glaneuse, literally means the male gleaners and the female gleaner. It becomes in English the Gleaners and I, simply because there's only one term in English for both the male and the female, whereas the French language, being gendered, can establish a distinction between les glaneurs, masculine plural, but which can include both male and female, and la glaneuse, feminine singular. So, les glaneurs, the gleaners filmed by Varda, and la glaneuse, the gleaner that Varda sees herself to be. The English title thus makes explicit what is implied in the French, namely the autobiographical aspect of the film. But while Varda does talk about herself as glaneuse, as someone who goes around collecting, gathering, accumulating for the purpose of making films, I would want to claim that it does not give her such a prominent place as the I of the English translation seems to suggest. The film is not as much about I as about the fact that she, too, is a gleaner, and that filmmaking, or at least this is the case for the very unique type of filmmaking Varda produces, is very much a practice or an art of gleaning. As you've seen, Varda establishes a parallel between many different types of gleaning, the kind that provides sustenance, the kind that leads to artistic creation, the kind that leads to painterly or musical representations, and finally, the kind that filmmaking embodies. I see those various practices as woven together in the film, weaving in and out of each other, as it were, throughout the film. So while the English translation posits Varda as the authorial voice on a different plane than the gleaners themselves, the French title more readily opens the door to comparison, to what might be common to all the different gleaners the film will focus on, including the filmmaker. So, les glaneurs, masculine, and la glaneuse, feminine. I repeat this because the film, among many other things, is also about how men and women seem to practice the technique of gleaning differently, how the male gaze of painters, Jean-François Millet, Jules Breton, etc., inscribes the women gleaners on the canvas. And you will have noted that no painting ever represents a male gleaner. And of course, it is about Varda's own very unique way of filmmaking, which some have termed feminine or feminist. Varda was, after all, one of the first one of the first women filmmakers in France to gain some notoriety. Her filmography includes over 50 films. The first, La Pointe Courte, dating back to 1955, when she was 27 years old, a precursor to the New Wave, a movement from the 1960s that revolutionized the way films were made. Low-budget handheld camera, location shooting, use of non-professional actors, and so on. Varda calls her form cinécriture, a cross between cinema, filmmaking, and écriture, writing, a term that was picked up by the directors of the New Wave for their own approach to filming. All right, this is it for the French lesson. You can always sign up for one of our classes if you'd like to know more about French cinema, and in this case, really Belgian cinema, since Varda is Belgian-born. For now, let me give the floor to Agnes herself, who shares in her director's note what compelled her to make the film. The film is a documentary woven from various strands, from emotions I felt when faced with precariousness, from the possibilities offered by the new small digital cameras, and from the desire to film what I can see of myself, my aging hands and my gray hair. I also wanted to express my love for painting. I had to piece it together and make sense out of all of this in the film without betraying the social issue that I had set out to address: waste and trash. Who finds a use for it? How? Can one live on the leftovers of others? Film always originates in emotions, she goes on to say. This time it was that of seeing so many people foraging the marketplace or rummaging through supermarket trash containers for leftovers. Seeing them made me want to film them, and specifically that which cannot be filmed without their consent. How can one testify for them and yet not hinder them? That seems to be the question, the ethic motivating Varda's work. Let me draw your attention, for instance, to the type of exchange or the quality of the relationship established by Varda between her subjects, the people she films and converses with. And to do so, let me take something I myself gleaned from the film. You will remember that at one point in the documentary in Burgundy, Varda comes across a man in a vineyard who invites her into his home where they meet his wife. It is an accidental meeting. It turns out that the man is Jean Laplanche, a famous psychoanalyst known for having developed an anti-philosophy of the subject in which the other is always foremost in the construction of subjectivity. During the encounter, Laplanche makes a statement that for me encapsulates the quality of the relationships established in the film. He states that l'homme trouve son origine dans l'autre. Man finds his origin in the other. That is, of course, men and women find their origin in the other or in others. Simply put, it is the other who makes me. Without the other, I would not be. What Varda does admirably well in what she calls a traveling road documentary is to give the people she meets humanity by allowing them to speak of their life from the vantage point of their vulnerable circumstances, poverty, hunger, despair, or of their artistic or ethical choices. As she herself says, I quote, "I wanted to glean images as one jots down travel notes, but always coming back to the gleaners, trying to win their confidence, listen to them, converse with them rather than interview them and film them. Little by little, I found the right balance between self-referential moments, the gleaner who films one of her hands with the other, and moments focused on those whose reality and behavior I found so striking. I managed to approach them, to bring them out of their anonymity. I discovered their generosity." Varda thus avoids the pitfall of voyeurism that mars so many documentaries. A voyeur is, of course, someone who observes someone with a curiosity that can border on the perverse, the looking at someone who is unaware of being looked at, bringing some kind of pleasure to the onlooker. Many critics have claimed that filmmaking is akin to voyeurism, and that as a result, the spectator can be turned into a voyeur through an identification with the gaze of the director. Varda's work could not be further from that. She says herself, "I think I got people's confidence because I was not looking at them like insects that I would film." And Varda is also part of the documentary, somehow able to turn herself into material for the film. She has the uncanny gift of succeeding in enticing people to talk who might not otherwise do so. She's incredibly at ease with her interlocutors, able to draw from them intimate and honest reflections while encouraging self-reflexiveness. With every encounter, she reaches her goal of bringing people out of their anonymity and revealing their generosity. Varda is carried by her keen interest in people's lives, a sense of solidarity that speaks from the heart. As she says, "I'm trying to capture something more fragile than a regular story. I love what people bring me." She shows respect for others while showing their humanity, their resilience, their strengths of character. And she does so with a humility imbued with a sharp sense of humor, a genuine curiosity about the other, not as an object of study, but as a human being, an interest in what those in the margins of society do with what our society discards in an age of global consumption and waste. Without the other, I would not be. Without Varda, we should then say, the Gleaners would not be. Varda's documentary is thus, I would like to claim, the epitome of hospitality, but not just a one-way hospitality. While she gives the people she encounters a voice, a place, providing the historical context for the practice of gleaning and for the way it shapes people who engage in it, these people in turn give Varda the materials for the movie and the possibility of inserting herself in an auto-reflective manner into the film itself. She engages people, and they, in return, enable her to engage in some sort of self-portrait where she reflects with great honesty on the passing of time, on her own aging and mortality. I am an animal I do not know, she says. Or later, in a different film, aging for me is not a condition, but a subject. Varda approaches the subject that is herself with the same curiosity she devotes to all the subjects of her documentaries. No self-pity, no attempt to conceal the aging process, just the cruel reality, the raw fact that life leads to death. While the practice of gleaning endures through the ages, Varda's own life is finite, as we know. What she has gleaned from her encounters is this frailty of human existence together with her own mortality, even if the product of her gleaning, the film itself, will outlast her. Let me try to open up this theme of hospitality from a more historical perspective. Behind the practice of gleaning, there are, as we saw, laws that guarantee a right to glean, that turn lands that are owned into hospital territory, where people in need are welcome. As we are reminded in the documentary, in 1554, a royal ordinance by Henry II recognized gleaning as a way to stave off poverty. The destitute, that is the poor, the elderly, the physically incapacitated, and children, as well as those, a whole category unto themselves, it seems, who do not have the strength to saw, S-A-W, are to be allowed in fields after the harvest so they can pick up what has been left over. The roots of French socialism do run very deep. The word glaner, in fact, appears in the French language already in the 13th century, right around the time King St. Louis, also known as Louis IX of France, introduced an ordinance that forbade owners from bringing their cattle into fields that had just been harvested, instituting a waiting period of 3 days so that the poor would be able to collect leftovers. But of course, the allowance made for this practice was not born in France. Indeed, uses and regulations regarding gleaning go all the way back to the Jewish Bible or Old Testament. So in Leviticus 23:22, we read, "And when you reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not make clean riddance of the corners of thy field when thou reapest, neither shalt thou gather any gleaning of thy harvest. Thou shalt leave them unto the poor and to the stranger." And in Deuteronomy 24:19, "When thou cuttest down thine harvest in thy field, and hast forgotten a sheaf in the field, thou shalt not go again to fetch it. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow." So in France, gleaning, as well as grappillage, that is grape picking, and by extension, the picking of anything that grows on a branch, apples, figs, walnuts, olives, and so on, and ratelage, something that is not mentioned in the film, but has to do with the raking of prairies for leftover fodder, grass, and hay. These three activities are authorized still today. And I refer those of you looking for a summer occupation to Articles 520 of the Civil Code and R26 of the Penal Code for more details. In an 1841 review and critique of French legislation, I found this interesting formulation that tells a lot about how laws have been, at various times, imbued with human charity and concern for the other. It says that gleaning is the patrimoine du pauvre, the patrimony of the poor, that is, the inheritance or heritage the cultural or national heritage of the poor. The poor, the destitute, do not own anything properly speaking, but according to this text of 1841, they own the practice of gleaning. Gleaning belongs to them as a property or a right. But with the question of how to protect gleaners comes, of course, that of how to protect against them. And so at the very time laws are written to protect the rights of gleaners, there is a proliferation of ordinances against thieves and predators who might not only glean, but also steal the farmer's actual harvest. In 1731, for example, in a small rural town, 10 women were condemned to public lashing, branded with a hot iron, and forced to wear a sign that said, "Thieves who have stolen grain during the harvest under the pretense of gleaning." In towns and cities, gleaners don't glean in the fields, but collect leftovers from the markets, salvage or recycle or repurpose discarded objects and broken furnitures. As we are told, res derelicte is the legal term that allows such deliberately abandoned, ownerless things to be taken without it being regarded as theft. It is unclear to what extent Varda has a political agenda here, but one issue she exposes has since then been addressed by French law. You will remember that Varda presents the different sides of a case about street youth who were arrested for scrounging supermarket dumpsters for leftover food. In an attempt to prevent dumpster diving, supermarkets started dousing discarded food with bleach. Well, in 2015, France became the first country to make it mandatory for large supermarkets to donate unsold food to charity. About 5,000 charities throughout France benefit from this law that helps save up to 66 pounds of food per person per year. So for Varda, gleaning is thus an affair not only of the heartland, but of the heart. In France, the largest organization of soup kitchens is called Resto du Cœur, literally restaurant of the heart or from the heart. Varda thus makes of the heart of her film, looking for heart-shaped potatoes among the gleanings, this search coming to punctuate the narrative as a heartbeat. When The Gleaners and I came out in 2000, it met with incredible success. The audience would stand up and clap at the end of showings, and the film generated an extraordinary amount of mail, together with gifts of oddly shaped, non-calibrated vegetables from all corners of the globe. There are today campaigns in France to incite people to give oddly shaped vegetable a try or a chance. And there is even a restaurant in Paris that makes a point of only serving them. Somehow, Varda had struck a chord, had spoken to something in ourselves that is there, more or less latent, that makes us want to reach out, something that pulls us away from our own preoccupation with consumption and self-preservation. The film hit such a chord that 2 years later, in 2002, Varda made what she calls a bonus film, and the title is The Gleaners and I, 2 years later, one that revisits some of the people and places discovered in the first movie. We thus learned that, spoiler alerts, Salomon's friend from Vietnam has died, that Alain, the unemployed chemist who teaches French to the illiterate, has gotten some visibility, and people now buy his newspaper in front of Gare Montparnasse because of the film, that Claude, the alcoholic, is now in social housing, and so on. The filming of the bonus documentary ends on May 1st, 2002, the French Labor Day, at a demonstration against Jean-Marie Le Pen, the leader at the time of the French extreme right party, the National Front. This scene resonates all the way to today, where right-wing movements are becoming increasingly central to political discourse, not just in France, but in Europe more generally. A discourse that preaches closing the doors of the nation state to the foreigner, the other, the one who does not have, the destitute. from the hospitality afforded the poor, the have-nots, made into a legal obligation as early as the 13th century, to French laws in the 90s, defining a délit d'hospitalité, the crime of hospitality, as the act of helping out, housing, feeding so-called illegals, an act punishable by imprisonment. The limit or border between hospitality and inhospitality has never ceased to waver. While there is no longer such thing exactly as délit d'hospitalité on the books, there have been since then in France a number of recent occurrences when volunteers helping migrants have been harassed by the police, and French citizens have been taken to court and found guilty of having harbored or fed or helped the undocumented. We still have a lot of work to do. Varda gives us glimpses into the lives of those who have a special relation with gleaning. She bears witness with dignity, humor, and grace, giving visibility to an often ignored part of society, celebrating the artistic ingenuity of some, admiring the ethical choices of others, bringing us, the spectator, to a new understanding of humanity, to a new invitation to being a human, to new conceptions of solidarity and hospitality. What Varda teaches us, perhaps, is that life is not just about us as a series of eyes, or even about gleaning, about glaneur or glaneuse, masculine or feminine, but as the Italian translation of the French title has it, La vita è un raccolto. Life is a harvest. And as every farmer knows, when the harvest comes, it's time for all hands to be on deck, time for all hands to lend a hand. Simply put, what Varda's documentary reminds us is that we must never forget that l'homme trouve son origine dans l'autre. Before handing over the microphone, I can't resist showing you the trailer of one of Varda's recent films, Faces, Places, in which, once again in her inimitable way, she takes to the roads of France, together with a photographer named J.R., the artist behind the 2017 art installation of The Wall between Mexico and the US, where you see a one-year-old baby peering over the wall near San Diego. Faces, Places earned Varda a Best Documentary Oscar nomination in 2018. As in The Gleaners and I, Varda puts the human at the center of the landscape, unearthing the human to give it a new identity, a new beauty, a new generosity. So here we go. And I don't know how to turn the light off, but I'm fine.
Moi, j'ai 33 ans. Et toi, je dirais plutôt que tu as 88 printemps.
Le truc rigolo, c'est qu'on va faire un film ensemble.
Bah ouais, c'est ça le point de départ. Tu sais, c'est avec ce camion que je pars partout dans le monde. T'es partante?
Je suis toujours partante si on va vers des paysages simples, vers des villages, vers des visages.
Les gens y rentrent à l'arrière, comme dans un photomaton, et la photo sort dans les 5 secondes sur le côté, en grand format.
Un facteur, c'est important dans le village.
On y va, on part par là-bas!
JR répond à ce que je souhaite le plus. Les visages que je rencontre, les photographies, pour qu'ils ne tombent pas aussitôt dans les trous de ma mémoire. Je dis bonjour qu'aux jeunes.
Bah oui, parce qu'ils sont à ta taille.
Le but, c'est le pouvoir de l'imagination.
Mais qui c'est qui a eu l'idée?
Lui, hein, pas moi. Moi, je suis pas fière de mes pieds, je les trouve trop petits.
Oh, c'est vrai qu'ils paraissent petits. C'est vrai. C'est juste l'installation de l'échafaudage qui est soumis à autorisation.
Alors moi, je vais vous dire quelque chose entre nous. Toutes les amendes, vous pouvez les envoyer à Agnes Varda.
Et tu as pis?
C'est surprenant.
Et l'art, c'est pour surprendre aussi les gens, non? Allez, bonne journée, au revoir.
Pascale-Anne Brault. We're so lucky to have you here at DePaul, Pascale-Anne. Thank you so much. And I think our DePaul Barnes & Noble's reps have some of Pascale-Anne's work for sale out in the foyer, so you should check that out before you leave. So up next, we have a very special artistic presentation. Ben Kinsinger received his BA in communication from Wheaton College, and he's now the music director for I.O. Theater and a multimedia artist, composer, and songwriter. Last year, I saw Ben's video and music performance of a piece focusing on Orpheus's trip to the underworld, and I soon contacted him to commission a new performance to fit our topic tonight, which we're pleased to premiere. As you'll see, his work focuses on blurring the distinction among composer, storyteller, and performer in smart and entertaining ways. So joined tonight by Jacob Gordon on bass, Jarrett Long on drums, Felipe Tobar on violin, Damon Coachman on trumpet, and Jerome Hicks as the dramaturge, with his new work entitled Arachne. Please join me in welcoming Ben Kinsinger.
Lady, you have gone, and the world was made a smaller place for your leaving it. To what prison did they take you? For what crime must you renounce? The clouds rolled by like the puffed-up brains of forgotten gods, scattered across the sky to blanket the world. They are temperamental by nature, these thoughts, these brains, unwoven by the air and hurled in the anger of a storm. Yours were gentler tapestries to swaddle and admire. Stories of hindsight and perfection, making sense of history in context. You wove not to separate so easily. Inextricable fibers twisted into figures animated by your hands. Was this your sin? To excel at weaving and in it enfold the temperaments of our proud gods. The gaseous brains of the old disinterested ones were dashed by an Olympian spring, and in their righteous pride consumed the world for their enjoyment. They have consumed you too. Weave for us again, you chiding suspirer. Tell us our stories in your cloth and hide away your mockery, for it has brought you nothing but absence. Absence of yourself, of us, and our own acutely born in a world without its star. What did you think upon waking? Were you frightened? Did the prison promise an open window, a long path to an inevitable escape? The gods are cruel with time, for they have all of it, while we have but a little. And when did you notice your beast? Maybe you didn't for a while. Groggy you lay distorted from yourself, your punishment not yet a conscious thought. Your eyes could not see, not like they used to. You were nearly blind. Instinctively your arms and legs reached out to feel the walls of your cell, but found only a clinging netted lay. You moved to touch your eyes, but only legs answered. You tried to tell your arms to move again, but again, only legs respond. You waited. Maybe it will all make sense when you can see. Maybe a light will come and show you what it is you do not understand. But nothing. How long did it take? There was no mirror that would help to tell you of your transmutation. Imitating life itself. A lonely birth of a new form. Accepting. Persisting. Ignorant. Pain. The gods made you their mockery, thought to make you our disgust, hideous in form, condemned and strange even to yourself. Did you weep, Arachne? For your hands? For us? For the gods, their unqualified anger? Did you curse them? Did you curse them as we curse them, or did you hate them? Did you hate them as we hate them? For you, we hate them. What webs they thought to spin of our poor abilities. We are bound to one another where the movement of one pulls like a causal strain on the whole, distorting intention. You understood this. You loved us in this. Your cloth sought to depose their willful command. No gods. There are no gods to lodge inside our hearts. There are no gods in the pillowed sky. There are no gods to judge you or tell us to believe in them more than you. We believe in you, mother of looms, of webs, of spiders, of womb. The gods can nurse their wounded pride in the darkness of our forgetfulness and the absence of our love. What right had they to punish and pronounce you vile and contemptible? What right had they to take you from us? What right had they to put you in a cage? Build walls of our acceptance, birth monsters, and tell us to be afraid. We watch you in the shadowed places of the earth. Not all of us remember the work and beauty of your lost hands. Not all of us remember your exile. Some know, and some see, that from the scorn of gods we broken must be free. Arachne is the mother of spiders, the master of webs, the fallen one, the scorned. Arachne is long gone.
And that's how you do that. Wow. Nice, nice. Thank you so much. That was beautiful, Ben. Thank you. Our final presenter this evening is Tamara Ketabgian. Tamara is professor of English at Bullock College in Wisconsin, where she teaches courses on 19th century British literature and culture, critical theory, science fiction, the Enlightenment, and the history of technology. I also recently learned that she has an interest in steampunk culture, so that means we'll probably have to have her back to talk about that. In 2005, the North American Victorian Studies Association awarded her the Donald Gray Prize for the best essay in Victorian studies, and her 2011 book, The Lives of Machines, The Industrial Imaginary in Victorian Literature and Culture, was shortlisted for the annual book prize of the British Society for Literature and Science. We're very pleased that she can make the trip down to be with us tonight with her lecture entitled Victorian Garbage, Disgust, Desire, and Our Mutual Friend. I'm pleased to introduce to you Tamara Ketabgian. Sorry, Tamara.
Thank you so much. That was a really hard act to follow. It was a beautiful musical performance. And today, actually, I'm going to be talking with you all about a different kind of metamorphosis, a different kind of transformation. So hopefully we'll think of some connections with that. So today, I would like to talk about the Victorian roots of our modern garbage problems and obsessions. We'll dive into both desire and its flip side, disgust. Late 19th century Britain was a world of things, things to buy, to eat, to wear, a growing array of commodities and trash. Victorians were beginning to worry, like us today, that they were consuming things that were garbage, that were made from garbage, or that would soon become garbage, much like us today. Is it organic? Was this made in a sweatshop? They were worried that these things and practices would transform them, would make them into garbage, that they themselves were the garbage. For Victorians, the counterpart to this commodity culture was an obsession with sanitation and purity, domestic purity, with the angel in the house, as they called it. And today, too, I'd like to suggest we insist on the magical joy of tidying up, on the need to cleanse our bodies, our spirits, our homes. So the question today is, how did we get from this? These are the remnants of a late Victorian landfill, essentially garbage pit, to this. How did we get here? How did we get here? One answer to this question can be found in our mutual friend, in Charles Dickens's iconic 1865 novel about garbage and recycling. In this late, dark novel, Dickens describes both the actual physical waste of London and its human scum, as he calls it, human beings as garbage. And the wealth in this novel comes from a huge inherited fortune in dust, primarily coal dust from urban households. The story portrays complicated ecosystems of urban wealth and waste in which people trade both socially and financially upon a drowned man and his golden dust mound. And here you can see the wrapper to the first episode of Our Mutual Friend, and it gives a sense of the novel's really vast multi-plot span. People have compared it today to David Simon's massive Dickensian TV series, The Wire, and I think it's a very apt comparison. It's no coincidence that Our Mutual Friend was located right at the cusp of broader changing practices and attitudes toward garbage, what Professor Tom License describes as a revolution in rubbish. This explosion of disposable and recyclable things began in the 1870s with a steep rise of throwaway bottles, jars, and consumer packaging. And this vision corresponds with Our Mutual Friend's landscape of fragmented, recycled, and disposable objects and humans. It also corresponds with disgust in Our Mutual Friend as a way of seeing, as a way of knowing, and as a way of navigating this landscape of garbage within a changing modern world. So I'd like to begin with one example of navigating this world, how Our Mutual Friend refers to scum itself. The scene is one of slumming, where a shabby, genteel, marginally employed barrister, lawyer, Eugene Rayburn, and his friend and fellow lawyer, Mortimer, go to investigate the discovery of a corpse, the body of a young man who's soon to inherit this vast dust mound fortune of old John Harmon. It's also where Eugene meets his working class object of obsession and his eventual future wife, Lizzie Hexam. Lizzie is the daughter and helper of the river corpse finder, Gaffer Hexam, who finds the body and pockets the reward money for it. And in this passage, we go from high to low and lower in a carriage from a high society party in London's Tony West End to the east and south, following a path of downward washing and draining to the river. And you get this here with the carriage wheels. They rolled on and rolled down by the monument, by the tower, by the docks, by Ratcliffe, by Rotherhithe, down by where accumulated scum of humanity seemed to be washed from higher grounds like so much moral sewage, and to be pausing until its own weight forced it over the bank and sunk it into the river. So this scene evokes a range of meanings. What is the scum here? Does the scum of humanity refer to people or to the actual waste and ooze produced by them? Is it the people or is it the stuff? Dickens suggests the latter, physical waste, but the passage also still retains a link with humans. Who are the people associated with this scum? The people who make it, who work with it, who live in it, or who are it? And what is our attitude toward it? How does our mutual friend imagine the threats and attractions of all that is low, scum? Who is disgusted and who is disgusting? And again, I think about the different class and object positions that Peter was referring to in his introduction. How do we distinguish between these two or more positions? And who, what is the we? Do readers identify with the narrator? With Eugene Rayburn, the gentleman in the carriage? With Lizzie Hexam, the corpse finder, river dredger's daughter? And arguably, you can't get any lower than Lizzie in terms of labor and class status. So the psychoanalyst and theorist Julia Kristeva provides a useful way to understand this scum as something that is abject, that is neither object nor subject, but instead blurs and challenges relations between self and thing. She defines a crisis of disgust and identification, which turns the self inside out and outside in. What Kristeva describes here approaches the complex affect of Our Mutual Friend, I'd suggest, as a novel that embraces scum, that pursues, and I'd argue, even enjoys the disgusting. Our Mutual Friend actively participates in slumming and in the moral ambiguity of this process, its combination of attraction and repulsion. This moral ambiguity of the abject is embodied by Eugene and Mortimer, the gentleman in the carriage that we heard about earlier. In their dealings with the Hexams, they are perhaps not as superior as they first seem, as Eugene notes here. The philosopher William Ian Miller has argued that disgust occurs as an act of self-assertion, of moral evaluation and hierarchical distinction. It allows us to claim our status as higher, to distinguish between the disgusted and the disgusting. And so, as Miller says here, disgust evaluates negatively what it touches, proclaims the meanness and inferiority of its object. But disgust is also a nervous claim, as he puts it, that recognizes the vulnerability of that superiority to the defiling powers of the low. So disgust occurs as a sort of judgment, but a judgment achieved through risk, as a claim of both status, but also status anxiety. We find this expression of disgust not only in middle-class characters, but also in working-class ones, in the novel's persistent focus on dirty work. Consider Gaffer and Lizzie Hexam's river scavenging. Oh, sorry about that. in which they find dead bodies in the river, take money from them, and also profit from reward money. This work is corrupting, degrading, and culturally taboo. Dickens portrays it through metaphors of cannibalism, murder, and predation. The dead, the river, the filth, they're all food for the hexam, so to speak. What makes it worse is the suspicion that, in the words of one character, hexam helps to their death, a few of those that he finds dead. That for hexam, making a living is also making a killing. And in the opening scene of his novel, Lizzie has only recently had to help her father, and to put it mildly, she doesn't like the work. And so here she's protesting that she can't sit so close to a corpse that they've found, that she can't bear it. And her father, Hexam, responds, "It's my belief you hate the very sight of the river." I do not like it, Father, as if it wasn't your living, as if it wasn't meat and drink to you. At these latter words, the girl shivered again, and for a moment paused in her rowing and seemed to turn deadly faint. Now, it's striking here that Lizzie is herself capable of disgust. She's a character who's the lowest of the low, described by others as an illiterate female waterman, and in terms that would associate her with the most fallen and marginal of women. Her faintness expresses her anxiety about the threat of consuming and becoming the abject and unspeakable. This disgust also asserts Lizzie's claim to moral superiority, her judgment that she is above and distinct from the corpse, the river, the scum, and her family's work. And as we'll discover, she is somehow still pure, despite, maybe even because of, this dirty environment. Lizzie is, through sheer force of will, a diamond in the rough, a mythical Cinderella figure, miraculously pure and beautiful amid the cinders. And through her, our mutual friend thus performs a magical process of alchemy, a fairy tale ritual of purity and domestic transformation. But the hexams aren't the only ones in our mutual friend that perform dirty work. They are part of a larger food chain that operates through garbage, scavenging, and recycling, through images of consumption and assimilation, of eating and being eaten, of trading and transformation. We have, for instance, the middle-class Veneerings, who dine off the Harmon murder. They use the Hexam and Harmon story to dive and scavenge for influential friends and prey who will help Veneering's business and political ambitions. We also have the novel's dust heaps themselves, the story's central source of wealth and meaning. They, too, raise questions of value and labor. What is actually dirty and dirty work? What is the source of value? In both Dickens's novel and the world surrounding it, these dust mounds formed a massive economic operation from all of the household garbage they collected. And here you can see some images of the dust heaps and their workers, what they actually look like. And if they look a bit like the Gleaners, that's no coincidence. These are actually all women here working in the view of the dust yard. And here is a somewhat later photograph, also of a dustman. And also of the dust heap. Also, we have an image here of the dust heap that likely first inspired Dickens. And this sold for the fantastical sum of 40,000 pounds. That's almost the equivalent of, actually it's a little bit more than the equivalent of $4 million today. Along with its dust heaps and river dredgers, our mutual friend also explores characters who seek to contain and deny their place within this food chain, who seek to maintain middle-class purity and propriety. The businessman, Mr. Podsnap, for instance, is filled with disgust toward the poor and seeks to deny any reference to their hunger and suffering at his dinner parties. He views their very mention as offensive, repugnant, and threatening. And part of Podsnap's greater sanitary politics is his expression of disgust and denial toward anything different or threatening, that we should just throw and, in fact, sweep, as he puts it, sweep it away. He even develops a particular gesture to express this dismissal, a peculiar flourish of his right arm in clearing the world of its most difficult problems by sweeping them behind him and consequently shear away. For Podsnap, this throwaway stance is not only economic but also national. He condemns all that does not have pure identity, anything that is not English. And here in the second paragraph, we see this. Although his business was sustained upon commerce with other countries, he considered other countries a mistake, and of their manners and customs would conclusively observe, not English, when presto, with a flourish of the arm, and a flush of the face, they were swept away. Although we know Podsnap engages in foreign trade, he fears international contamination. He clings to an image of England as an isolated, sceptered isle, defined by borders and barriers, by cleansing and flushing out, in short, by a stringent sanitary program. Other countries are put nowhere by Podsnap's magical thinking and tidying. Of course, Podsnap's very concept of proper, clear Englishness is dependent on the human garbage he sweeps away from it by its relation to the poor, the foreign, the dirty, and the dead. His anxious attempt to build an imagined community of Britons occurs through the visceral exclusion of others, through what Sian Nai has termed a strangely unsocial form of sociability. So it's no stretch to compare Podsnap to this, then, to a Brexit Little Englander who defines nation through threatened status, singularity, and borders. And we'll see what happens on Friday, by the way. Okay, so, or we can even compare Podsnap to this, to the highly embodied spatial model reportedly posed by our own current US president. These terms present the fantasy of a pure national or social body where waste or so-called foreignness is combined to a lower nether region, a region identified with the global south. Yet, pointedly, Podsnap's greatest disgust is toward Lizzie Hexam and Eugene Rayburn's eventual marriage as a site of pollution through class mixing and miscegenation. For Podsnap, this union deeply undermines the purity of the nation. And as he says here, my gorge rises against such a marriage. It offends and disgusts me. It makes me sick, right? In our mutual friend, we also find a compelling counter-image to Podsnap in the character Mr. Venus's shop, with its affirmative portrait of social mixing, of miscellaneous cosmopolitan community. This messy and greasy shop embraces the work of recycling and trash art, of montage and bricolage. It transforms disgust into wonder and beauty while celebrating the origins of its source matter. As a taxidermist and skeleton builder articulator, Venus creates miscellanies, composite skeletons made of hybrid foreign sources. As he says here, we run so much into foreign. But does our mutual friend go with the aesthetic of Venus's shop, of miscellanies and mixing? Dickens's novel reconsiders the disgusting and seeks to redeem and revalue it, not only in Lizzie, but also in a whole host of lower-class characters whose dirty work has real worth and benefit. it affirms the transformative and life-giving powers of the low. But the novel also does not do so entirely. Our mutual friend still pursues its own cleanup job in the end. Venus's shop, the shop you see here, is tidied up. The dust heaps are carted off, and other corrupt characters are swept away in scavengers' carts or left to die in scummy river dams. And I'm really not exaggerating, they are. As part of this cleanup job, Venus agrees not to articulate female skeletons to please his fiancée, who doesn't want to be, quote, viewed in that bony light, unquote. Here and elsewhere, Dickens seeks to keep domestic women out of circulation, away from the potentially contaminating food chain of the novel. So our mutual friend revalues and reassesses some kinds of garbage, but it doesn't question some of its related forms of purity, especially domestic feminine purity. The novel ends with the magical alchemy of Lizzie Hexam and its other romantic heroine, Bella Wilfer. Bella changes from a self-described mercenary wretch, a marriage market schemer. She changes from that into a domestic angel and Madonna, as you see her in this image. Bella doesn't read Marie Kondo, but rather The Complete British Family Housewife, which she uses as her guide for the domestic work of making and purifying her family, home, and nation. Dickens portrays these final domestic scenes as magical fictions of resolution that are too good to be true, set in a miraculous golden bower and recounted in fantastical, over-the-top language. In Our Mutual Friend, these domestic rituals serve as amazing fairy tales of purity, as acts of magical thinking and tidying. So, to use the title of another Victorian novel, is this the way we live now? Are these rituals still the Victorian garbage that we carry with us today? And what relation do they bear to the other garbage that they sweep away? Today, I've suggested that Dickens's purity rituals and dirty work are as interconnected as ever, and that it is only by exploring disgust that we can understand our own place in modern throwaway culture. Thank you very much.
That was terrific, Tamara. Thank you so much. It's an evocative and thoughtful reading of Dickens. And now I have a new word, podsnappery. I have to use that. All right, everybody. So traditionally at this point in the evening, we would begin a Q&A with our speakers and performers. But tonight we have something special planned for you. And I hope indeed that there will be many discussions and conversations to be had before we part ways. And I'm going to ask Pascale-Anne, Ben, and Tamara, please, to mingle with you just for this purpose. As we promised, we have free food and other gifts for you to take home this evening. Our thanks to you for having attended. But we'd like to present them to you and to continue on the conversation, not in this room, but in the Gallery of the Gross. It's an interactive exhibit that I've designed, and with the help of Anna, Alicia, David, and Bradley at the Humanities Center, we've assembled as a pop-up museum, or maybe a poop-up museum, so that you can have a chance to engage your senses as we continue to think together about some of the issues we've been investigating tonight. So you'll be able to play in mud, to do some gleaning, to learn about the history of Chicago traced through the way in which it handles the poop of its citizens. You'll hear the Bach and Beethoven Experience play music that was played on board the Titanic as it was sinking. Generally get your hands as well as your minds dirty. So where is this magical land, you ask? There is only one person who can take us there and reveal its entrance to us. So please join me in welcoming to the stage our final special guest of the evening, Filthy Willy Wonka.
So sing along, folks. Come and sing with me. stage, and it's a sing-along. It's a sing-along. And quench the sour stench, but you'll find that you are getting wiser, though you might cry, wishing to apply hand sanitizer. If you are parasites, simply look around and you really are a lot, not just a few. Try some of our food, and soon you'll chew on them. Find peace of mind in a world of others' defecation. We won't tell if you find it swell when you smell your own flatulation. Scoop, there'll be poop and lots of mud and slime and gleaning. Shake up the band, shake my hand. I swear it's never had a cleaning. If you wanna spew what you ate before, simply find a corner and spew it. All your bourgeois taste, refuse it. Wanna puke up Taco Bell? Let's Mountain Dew it. Everybody, come with me. It's a magical land. Come on.
The Gallery of the Gross is now open behind you. Please join Filthy Willy Wonka.
Come on.
And stay.
I won't bite, I promise.
Magnificent work. You enjoy it.
Thank you. Thanks.
The audience in a little more. Yeah, it's very hard to do all that.
They only come out at night when you're sleeping. Oh my God. I know. I just can't even think about that. I don't think I can go to sleep.
like on how to make that theatrical. So then it became like, let's do it as a show. And then to tie it in, I wrote a poem so that it would make sure that it was like the.
Well, which gets back to the car business.
Yeah, I don't know. It was one person. Yeah. You know, I mean.
Pick some cute things, right? Out of dirt.
Right? I've seen you do it, right?
Yes, it's like a mud tart.
Well, I think they're gonna put it away, so.
I love it.